Hello.
When the lights went out that night, I didn't think much of it at first. The hum of the refrigerator faded, the ceiling fan slowed to a stop, and the sudden silence wrapped around the house like a wool blanket pulled too tight. I lit 2 candles on the dining table more out of habit than necessity. We'd had outages before, and they never lasted long. But then my phone buzzed, and it was her. "Can my son stay with you tonight?" the message read. "Our power's gone too. He's near your area." I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, of course I'd help. I always help. That's who I am. But because the thought of having someone else in the house, in this dim, breathless house, made something shift in my chest. He wasn't a child anymore, I knew that. I hadn't seen him in a few years. And when I opened the door to let him in and saw how tall he'd gotten, how his eyes had settled into something calm and watchful, I felt a tremor run through me. The kind you feel when you drop a glass and catch it mid-air, too fast to think, but long enough to notice. I told myself it was nothing. I was just being polite. Just a tired woman in a quiet house. But if you've ever stood at the edge of something and looked down, knowing full well you might step forward, you'll understand what I mean when I say that something inside me had already cracked open. Before I go on and tell you what really happened that night, before I confess the secret I've buried deeper than anything else in my life, let me ask you something. Leave a comment. What city are you watching this from? And tell me, have you ever made a mistake that changed everything, and still, somehow, you couldn't stop yourself? It was a Wednesday. I remember because the garbage truck didn't come. I had spent most of the day vacuuming the corners of the house, the ones no one ever sees, not even me, really. But something about the quiet made me want to clean. The kind of cleaning where your body moves and your mind disappears. My husband had left early in the morning for a business trip, Barcelona, I think. He kissed the air near my cheek and said, "Don't forget to water the plant in the hallway." That was the only thing he said that day. The house always felt different when he was gone. Lighter, in a way, but also more hollow. Like it was waiting for someone who never showed up. I made tea, but didn't drink it. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, just watching the trees sway. Then the power cut out. A click, a pop, and then nothing. No hum, no fridge, no radio in the background. Just the tick of the old wall clock, which ran on batteries and didn't care if the world had gone dark. I was already lighting candles when she texted. My oldest friend. Her son was in town, visiting. Their apartment had lost power too. "Can he crash at yours tonight?" she asked. "It's just for one night. You've known him since he was a kid." I typed of course before I thought about it. I hadn't seen him since he was 17. He'd been all limbs and sarcasm back then. I remembered him eating cereal with a fork because he said spoons were too mainstream. Now he stood at my door like someone out of a different story. Older. Shoulders broader, jaw sharper, hair longer and messier, in a way that looked intentional. When I opened the door, he smiled, the same sideways smile I remembered, only quieter now. "Hey," he said. "Sorry for dropping in like this." I waved it off. "Come in. The whole neighborhood's out." He stepped inside, shaking the rain off his jacket. I noticed how he didn't smell like cologne or deodorant, but like something softer. Paper and wool. I made tea again. This time I poured 2 cups. We sat in the living room, lit by a half-melted candle I found in the drawer with all the old batteries. He looked around slowly, like he was remembering something. "It's exactly how I remember it," he said. "Even the weird painting in the hallway." I laughed, surprised by the sound of my own voice. "I've been meaning to take it down." "Don't," he said. "It suits the place." The conversation wandered. I asked about his studies. He told me he dropped out of architecture school, started drawing again. I make sketches now, he said. Portraits, mostly. People in cafes. Strangers. He took a small notebook out of his bag and flipped it open, showing me pages of faces. Some smiling, some not. All of them alive in ways I couldn't explain. He looked at me then. Have you ever modeled? I blinked. God, no. You should, he said, almost absent-mindedly, as he turned a page. You have one of those faces. Something about the way he said it made my skin tighten. I stood and cleared the cups. I'll make dinner, I said, more to the silence than to him. We ate by candlelight. It was pasta, the kind I could make in the dark, half asleep. He complimented it, and I said thank you like it was the first kind word I'd heard all week. Afterward, we washed the dishes together, shoulder to shoulder, his elbow brushing mine when he turned to reach the faucet. I felt the brush of skin and paused. He didn't. Later, I showed him the guest room. The small one with the creaky bed. He stood in the doorway, looking at the window, the way the shadows moved on the curtains. Feels like camping, he said. Kind of peaceful. I nodded. I hope the power comes back by morning. He smiled again. I kind of hope it doesn't. I didn't sleep well. I kept turning, half expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway, even though I knew he was asleep. At some point I got up, walked into the kitchen to get water, and saw that he'd left his notebook on the table. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. Flipping through the pages, past strangers and couples and waiters and sleeping people on trains. And then, suddenly, me. He'd drawn me. That night. Sitting in the candlelight. My hair pulled back, my face in profile, the shape of my hand resting on the table. It wasn't a flattering drawing, not stylized or pretty. But it was intimate. Honest. I closed the notebook quietly and tiptoed back to bed. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling fan that wasn't moving. The house felt like it was holding its breath. And so was I. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, dense, like it had absorbed the weight of everything unsaid. I woke up early, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't keep my eyes closed any longer. The silence pressed against me in a way it hadn't before, like it was watching, waiting. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, boiling water, setting 2 mugs on the counter, even though I knew I wouldn't drink mine. The candle from last night had melted down to a misshapen stump. I glanced at the clock, still off. The power hadn't returned. I found that I didn't mind. He was still asleep in the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and I paused when I walked by. I could see the top of his head, the blanket pulled just under his shoulder, one hand resting near his face. He looked peaceful. Younger. But not like a child. More like someone who hadn't yet been pulled under by the heaviness of things. I stood there too long. Long enough that I became aware of it. I moved on, hating how carefully I stepped. I opened the curtains in the living room. The sky was pale blue, washed out and wide. It looked like a painting left in the sun too long. I didn't bother turning on my phone. I didn't want to see texts from my husband, or the calendar reminders he liked to send me from the plane. I just stood at the window with my arms crossed, not thinking about anything in particular, until I heard the floor creak behind me. He was standing there, hair a mess, rubbing one eye with the back of his hand. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied. "I didn't wake you, did I?" He shook his head and smiled. "Nah. I heard the kettle. Figured I'd follow the smell of something hot." We sat in the living room again, this time without ceremony. The mug steamed between us, and I noticed how comfortable he seemed in the space now. His legs stretched out, one arm draped casually over the back of the couch. I sat straighter than I needed to. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe to anchor myself. We talked about nothing. How long the power might be out. Whether it would rain later. What the neighbors might be doing. But it wasn't about the content, it was the rhythm. The familiarity that somehow existed between two people who had only just become unfamiliar again. At one point, he asked if I had paper. For what? I asked. To draw, he said, as if it were obvious. I led him to the bedroom. The closet still had a small box of my old art supplies, shoved behind winter clothes and a forgotten yoga mat. I hadn't touched any of it in years. When I opened it, the smell of aged paper and dry graphite filled the room. You used to draw, he asked, peering over my shoulder. A little, I said, though it wasn't true. I used to draw a lot. Until it stopped feeling like mine. He sat on the floor and spread everything out, like a child opening a treasure chest. I stayed standing, arms folded. Watching him sort through my past with care. You should get back to it, he said without looking up. There's something still in your lines. I sat down beside him. Close, but not touching. We sifted through pages, some unfinished, some barely started. He held one up, a loose sketch of a hand holding a lemon. I like this one, he said. It's simple, but you can feel the tension in the grip. I looked at it. I hadn't remembered drawing it. But he was right. It was there, a kind of quiet urgency. There was a pause, and then it happened. We kissed. I don't know if I moved first, or if he did. I don't even remember the moment just before. 1 second we were surrounded by old paper, and the next, we were somewhere else entirely. There were no fireworks. No music swelling in the background. Just warmth and breath and skin. And the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and terrible. It didn't last long. It wasn't dramatic. But it changed everything. When it ended, I pulled away. My hand flew to my mouth, as if I could somehow hide what had already happened. He looked at me, eyes open, calm. Not smug. Not sorry. Just present. I'm sorry, I said quickly, not sure if I meant it. You don't have to be, he replied. But I did. I did have to be. I stood up and stepped over the scattered pages, saying something about needing air, about checking the fuse box, about anything that might sound like sense. He didn't follow me. He stayed there, on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of who I used to be. In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the sink and stared out the window. The sky had changed, darkened slightly, like a storm was thinking about forming. I told myself it was just a moment. That it didn't mean anything. That I was tired. That it wouldn't happen again. But the truth was, something in me had shifted. And I knew it wasn't going back. The rest of that day passed in fragments. Moments that didn't stitch together properly. I moved through the house like someone wearing a dress that didn't fit anymore, constantly pulling at the seams, hoping no one would notice how uncomfortable it felt. He stayed mostly in the guest room, the door open just enough to remind me he was still there. I heard the scrape of a pencil now and then. No music. No laughter. Just lines being drawn, one after the other. I spent the afternoon cleaning the already clean kitchen. I wiped the same counter 3 times. Rearranged the mugs in the cabinet. Took out the trash even though it wasn't full. Anything to keep myself from going back to that room. From facing what had happened. Or from wondering if he would bring it up again. He didn't. Not even once. When evening crept in, I found myself lingering in the hallway, unsure of what I was waiting for. A confrontation? An apology? Another mistake? The power was still out, and I didn't bother lighting more candles. The natural light dimmed slowly, and the house faded with it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway just as I was pretending to look for something in a drawer. "We should get out," he said, quiet but steady. "Go for a drive or something. Get some fresh air." I looked up at him and nodded without thinking. I told myself it would be good, neutral ground. Movement. Something that didn't involve being alone in small rooms with too much silence. The roads were mostly clear. The outage had hit our block, not the surrounding streets. We drove with the windows down. The wind tangled my hair, and I didn't care. We didn't talk much. A few words here and there. Nothing heavy. Just enough to keep the silence from taking over. Then he pulled into the grocery store parking lot. I looked at him, puzzled. "We're out of bread," he said. He was right. We were. But it still caught me off guard, the ordinariness of it. After everything, we were here, shopping for bread. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and I followed him through the aisles like it was the most normal thing in the world. He picked up oranges, a bag of coffee, a loaf of whole grain. I stood by the cereal, staring at boxes I didn't recognize. He glanced over and smiled faintly. "Still prefer the honey oat flakes?" I blinked. "You remember that?" "Yeah," he said, tossing a box into the cart. "Used to sneak them when I stayed over." We paid and left. The air outside felt cooler than before. Cleaner, somehow. I expected us to head home, but he turned the car toward the park instead. "We've got time," he said. "Before it gets dark." We found an empty bench and sat in the fading light. The sky was soft gray now, the kind that hinted at rain but never delivered. Trees whispered above us, and the occasional car passed in the distance. For a long time, we said nothing. Then he asked, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang there, vibrating in the air between us. "Sometimes," I finally said. "But I'm the one who built it. So maybe that makes it mine." He nodded slowly, looking at his hands. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. We both knew. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in a way that made everything feel like it might tip over. I felt it inside me, too, that precarious edge, where a single breath could shift the balance. Eventually, we stood and walked back to the car. No words, just the crunch of gravel underfoot. When we got home, the street was still dark. Still powerless. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and paused. Something had changed. Not the house itself, but the way I saw it. The walls, the furniture, the routines etched into every corner, they all felt thinner, like scenery in a play that was about to end. He went straight to the guest room. I stayed in the kitchen, pressing my fingers into the counter like it might anchor me. The candle from the night before had burned itself into a pool of wax, hardened and opaque. I scraped it out with a spoon and threw it away. Later, as I passed by the guest room again, I saw the door was open, and he was drawing. Knees up, pad on his lap, head down. He didn't look up. I didn't stop. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photos on the dresser. Me and my husband at a vineyard. Me and my friend at her wedding. A faded print of our dog, who'd died years ago. We looked happy. Or maybe just practiced. I wondered what someone else would see if they found these photos, if they'd know what was missing. I changed into a nightgown and lay down without turning the lights on. It didn't matter. Nothing worked anyway. I thought I'd cry. But I didn't. I just stared at the ceiling, heart thudding too fast for sleep. Something had shifted. And it wasn't going back. The next morning came with a strange stillness, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but rather settles across everything like dust. I woke to a room full of gray light and the distinct absence of sound. No hum from the fridge, no ticking from the old clock in the hallway, not even birdsong outside the window. I sat up slowly, unsure if I had slept at all, or if I had just drifted from one level of wakefulness to another. The power was still out. I got up and made my way to the bathroom, where the cold tiles under my feet brought me fully into the present. My reflection in the mirror startled me, not because I looked bad, but because I looked the same. After everything that had been stirring inside me, I expected some visual marker. But there was nothing. Just me. Just the same face that had smiled in family photos, attended school functions, cooked Sunday dinners. And yet, everything behind it felt altered. By the time I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, pouring cereal into a bowl, the kind of casual movement that suggested nothing had happened. And maybe for him, it hadn't. Maybe for him it was just a passing moment, a flicker. A kiss exchanged in a quiet house. But for me, it hadn't passed. We ate in silence. The kind of silence that used to be comfortable, but now pressed against my skin like something tight and unfamiliar. I found myself watching his hands, the way his fingers moved, the way he held the spoon, trying to decode what kind of person he really was. But there were no answers. Only more questions I didn't have the courage to ask. Eventually, he looked up at me and said, "My mom texted. Power's back at her place. I should head back soon." I nodded. Of course. He didn't move right away. Just sat there, the spoon resting against the side of the bowl, his expression unreadable. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking. Whether he regretted it. Whether he felt anything at all. But I didn't. Instead, I stood, collected the dishes, and rinsed them under cold water. I kept my back to him the whole time. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. I just couldn't face the part of myself that had let it happen, that had wanted it to happen. After breakfast, he packed his things quietly. I busied myself wiping the already clean countertops, rearranging the fruit in the bowl, anything that might make it seem like I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I heard every movement. The zipper on his bag. The rustle of fabric. The sound of his shoes sliding on the tile. When he stepped into the hallway with his bag slung over one shoulder, I turned to face him. He smiled faintly. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said. "Of course," I replied. "Any time." He opened the door, paused, and looked back at me. "It was good to see you again." I nodded, but didn't say anything else. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, as if it might open again and offer some kind of resolution. But it didn't. I went upstairs, stripped the guest bed, folded the blankets, and returned everything to its original place. Erasing the evidence. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't know what else to do. Later that afternoon, the power came back. The hum of the refrigerator returned, the clock began ticking, and the ceiling fan whirred to life. The house felt alive again, but I didn't. I felt displaced. Like I had been shifted 2 inches to the left, and nothing aligned anymore. That evening, my husband came home. He walked through the door like he always did, tired, distracted, phone in one hand, suitcase in the other. He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, muttered something about traffic, and dropped his bag in the hallway. I stood there, watching him move through the house, reconnecting with the space like he'd never been gone. We had dinner together, leftovers I reheated and pretended to have made fresh. He talked about meetings and colleagues, about the food on the plane, about some podcast he listened to. I nodded in all the right places, laughed when I was supposed to, and kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. At one point, he looked up at me and said, "You okay? You seem a little quiet." I smiled. "Just tired." He nodded and went back to his story about airport delays. After dinner, he turned on the TV and settled into the couch. I washed the dishes, each one carefully, as if scrubbing hard enough might clean away something more than just food. When I finished, I walked past him, told him I was heading up early, and he waved me off with a distracted "Okay, love you." I paused at the foot of the stairs, waiting. But he didn't look up. In our bedroom, I opened the top drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the small sketchbook he had left. He must have forgotten it, or maybe not. Maybe he meant for me to find it. I flipped through the pages slowly. The sketches were rough, but honest. Strangers in cafes. Dogs in parks. A woman on a train, leaning against the window. And then, near the end, me. The drawing wasn't polished. It didn't flatter or dramatize. But it was real. I looked tired in it. And still, there was something there, in the set of my mouth, the slope of my shoulder, that said more than I'd ever let out loud. I closed the sketchbook and placed it back in the drawer. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. The world outside was moving on, cars passing, porch lights flickering on, someone walking a dog down the sidewalk. But inside me, something was still. Not broken. Just waiting. And for the first time, I realized I didn't know what it was waiting for. The days that followed were strange in their normalcy. I slipped back into routine, or at least something that resembled it. I prepared meals, folded laundry, watered the plant in the hallway like he'd asked. My husband had returned fully to his rhythm, calls on speakerphone, suit jackets slung over chairs, empty mugs left beside the bed. He talked to me more now, as if the trip had reset his attention span, but the conversations remained on the surface. He didn't notice the shift in me. Or if he did, he chose not to ask. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop noticing everything. I moved through the house differently, as if the walls remembered. The guest room seemed smaller now. More compact, less innocent. I avoided it at first, then forced myself to clean it, just to prove I could. I washed the sheets, vacuumed the carpet, dusted the windowsill. When I finished, I stood in the doorway and stared at the bed. Nothing had happened there, and yet everything had. The tension had rooted itself in the air, and I didn't know how to remove it. I kept the sketchbook in the drawer, untouched. I didn't look at it again, but I didn't throw it away either. It became a kind of quiet proof of something real, even if it couldn't be named. Some days I thought about mailing it to him, other days I thought about burning it. But most days I just left it where it was and tried not to open the drawer. One afternoon, I received a message from my friend, his mother. It was casual, friendly. She wanted to meet for coffee. We hadn't seen each other in months. I agreed, trying to keep my reply as neutral as hers. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and soft jazz playing through overhead speakers. She looked the same, maybe a little more tired around the eyes, but still polished, still composed. We talked about nothing at first. Work. Neighbors. Someone from our book club who had moved away. I nodded, smiled, responded when I needed to. And then she mentioned him. Offhand, like it wasn't important. He's thinking of moving to Barcelona, she said. He mentioned it last week. Said he needs a change of pace. I kept my face still. Barcelona? She nodded. He's got some friends there. Artists. I think he wants something new. I stirred my coffee too long, watching the surface swirl. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and chose not to ask. There was a lot of that going around. Afterward, I walked home instead of driving. The streets were familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything looked a little different. The colors were sharper, the shadows deeper. Or maybe I was just seeing more than I used to. It wasn't about him. Not entirely. It was about the way everything else had dulled over time. About the slow erosion of self that comes from doing what's expected for so long, you forget what it feels like to want something without permission. When I got home, my husband was in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine. "Let's eat on the patio," he said. "It's warm tonight." We hadn't eaten outside in years. I agreed. The air was soft and still. He grilled chicken and made jokes about how he'd probably undercook it. I laughed at all the right moments. Halfway through the meal, he reached over and touched my hand. "You've seemed a little distant lately," he said. "Everything okay?" I paused. The truth sat heavy in my mouth. "I've just been tired," I said. "That's all." He nodded. "We should get away soon. Maybe take a weekend somewhere. Just us." I looked at him. Really looked. His face was kind, familiar. The lines around his mouth had deepened, and his hair had thinned a little at the temples. But he was still the man I married. The man who'd held my hand in waiting rooms, laughed in our kitchen at burnt toast, slept beside me for 20 years. He hadn't changed. Not really. I had. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, wondering when it had become background noise. I remembered the way the house felt in the dark, when the power had been out. How quiet it was. How alive it had felt. As if something was humming beneath the floorboards. In the morning, I dressed carefully. Not for anyone in particular. Just for myself. I wore the blouse he'd once said looked too dressy for errands, and put on lipstick for the first time in weeks. He noticed. "You look nice," he said. I smiled. "Thanks." I didn't tell him I was going to the gallery. The one downtown that featured local artists. I just said I had errands. The gallery was nearly empty when I arrived. Soft lighting. White walls. Sparse chatter from the front desk. And then I saw it. His sketch. The one of me. Not identical, altered just enough that only I would recognize it. The posture, the angle, the expression. But it was me. Unmistakably me. It hung in a corner, labeled simply, stillness. No price tag. Not for sale. I stood in front of it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, letting it hold me the way he hadn't. Letting it say what we never could. On the way out, I left a note at the front desk. Nothing dramatic. Just my name. My number. A folded scrap of paper with 2 words, "Thank you." That evening, back home, my husband told me he'd booked a cabin for the weekend. "Just a short drive," he said. "Somewhere quiet." I nodded. "Sounds nice." And it did. Because even if the story wasn't finished, even if there were pages I'd never show anyone, I was still here. Still turning up the volume. Still choosing how the next chapter would begin. The weekend came, and with it the cabin. He packed the car methodically, folded jackets, stacked snacks, a cooler filled with sparkling water and fruit. He even remembered the deck of cards we never used, as if this trip might change that. I watched him move through the kitchen, a checklist running silently in his head, and for a moment I felt a pang of something close to gratitude. Or maybe it was guilt. They looked the same from the inside. The drive was quiet. He played a podcast about politics, then turned it off halfway through. I stared out the window, counting the pine trees as they passed in a blur. The cabin was small, set back from the road, surrounded by trees that reached upward like arms asking something from the sky. It had a porch with 2 chairs, a hammock, and a narrow view of a lake through the trees. Inside, it was clean and minimal. Wood everywhere. A fireplace that smelled of past fires. He opened the windows, let in the breeze, and smiled at me like we were arriving at the beginning of something. I tried to mirror that smile, but it felt like folding paper the wrong way, creases where they didn't belong. The first night, we cooked together. Pasta, a salad, wine. He told stories from his trip, made me laugh a few times, brushed his hand across my back as he passed behind me. It wasn't that he didn't care. He did. Just not in the way I needed. Or maybe I had changed the shape of what I needed, and now nothing fit. That night, in bed, he reached for me. His hands were warm. Familiar. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. I let the moment pass like a train I didn't want to catch. He rolled over after a while, sighed, and fell asleep. I lay there listening to the wind in the trees, the creak of the porch boards shifting with the cool air. It felt like being underwater, muted, suspended. I wanted to get up, to walk outside and breathe, but I didn't move. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, tracing lines between knots in the wood, creating shapes that didn't exist. The next morning, I woke early. The light was soft, the kind that makes everything seem less urgent. I slipped out of bed, put on a sweater, and made coffee. The kettle whistled, and I filled 2 mugs out of habit. He came into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, hair a mess, and smiled at me like he always did. "Morning," he said. I handed him the coffee and nodded. After breakfast, we took a walk around the lake. The trail was muddy in places, and I had to hold on to his arm once or twice. He joked about my balance, and I let myself laugh. The trees were just beginning to change color, leaves tinged with orange and gold. It was beautiful. It really was. But beauty doesn't erase absence. We sat on a bench overlooking the water. He pulled a stone from his pocket and skipped it across the surface. I watched the ripples stretch outward, overlapping until they disappeared. He turned to me. "You're really quiet lately." I didn't look at him. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About how things change without warning," I said. He tilted his head. "You mean us?" I finally turned. His eyes were steady. Kind. Searching. "I don't know what I mean," I said. "Not just us. Everything." He reached for my hand and held it. His thumb brushed over my knuckles. "I still love you," he said. I nodded. "I know." He didn't ask if I felt the same. And I was grateful for that. That afternoon, while he napped, I sat on the porch with a sketchpad I found in the drawer of the cabin desk. It was mostly unused, a few rough lines at the beginning, then blank pages. I took the pencil and let my hand move without thinking. Shapes. Curves. A window. A chair. A face I didn't mean to draw. When I looked down, it wasn't him. It wasn't my husband. It was the other one. His jawline, his hands. The shape of his mouth caught in a moment of concentration. I flipped the page, angry with myself, but my hand kept moving. Over and over again, the same lines appeared. Familiar. Uninvited. I tore out the pages, crumpled them, and shoved them into my bag. That night, we played cards. We laughed when we lost count. Drank more wine than we usually did. It was nice. Not perfect. But something. Later, as I brushed my teeth, I looked at my reflection. I saw a woman trying. Really trying. To stay. To return. To make it work. But trying isn't the same as feeling. The next morning, we packed up. Folded the blankets, washed the mugs, took out the trash. The cabin closed around itself like a memory, ready to be handed off to the next couple, the next story. On the way home, he asked if I wanted to stop for lunch. Not hungry, I said. He didn't push. When we got home, I unpacked the bags and put the crumpled sketches at the back of a drawer, beneath old scarves and a tangled belt. I didn't throw them away. That evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, my phone buzzed. A message. No name. No context. It read, "I saw your note. I wasn't sure you meant it. I do now." My breath caught. I put the phone down. And for a long time, I stood perfectly still. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have. I must have read it 15 times, hoping the words would change, that their weight would lessen, but they never did. I wasn't sure what I had expected, or even what I'd wanted when I left that note. A gesture, maybe. Something I could claim without consequence. But now it had a pulse. Now it breathed. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned the phone over, screen down, as if that simple act could shut it all away. But even with it out of sight, it throbbed at the edge of my mind. His message. The certainty of it. The assumption that I knew what it meant. I walked into the kitchen, took a glass from the cupboard, filled it with water, and drank. It didn't help. My hands were shaking. I held the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something solid. The faucet dripped. The fridge hummed. The house made its usual sounds, but they seemed quieter now, drowned out by the noise in my chest. Upstairs, my husband was asleep. His gentle breathing was a rhythm I'd grown used to. Comforting in its repetition. I wondered what he would think if he knew, not the details, but just the shape of the truth. The emotional outline. Would he recognize the absence in me? Would he know it had been forming long before the message ever arrived? The next morning, I woke early. I dressed without turning on the lights. A navy shirt, clean jeans, boots. I brushed my hair back and left it loose. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to see. I left the house before sunrise. The air was still and cold. It clung to my skin like a warning. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only before the day starts making demands. I walked, not toward anything, but away. My feet chose the direction. My mind followed. At some point, I stopped in front of the gallery. It wasn't open yet. The lights inside were off, but the sketch was still there, in the same corner, unframed. I stood on the sidewalk, staring through the glass, watching the outline of myself stare back. It felt more real than my reflection ever did. I stayed there for a long time, not moving, not thinking. Eventually, I turned and walked away. I didn't know where I was going, but my body did. It remembered. By late morning, I found myself at the train station. I sat on a bench near the platform, watching people come and go. Travelers. Students. Couples. Everyone headed somewhere. Everyone choosing. I realized I hadn't made a choice in a long time. I'd simply allowed life to shape me like clay, passive, yielding, safe. My phone buzzed again. A second message. Same sender. I'll be at the old house at 5. You don't have to come. But I'll wait. I stared at the screen. The words didn't ask. They offered. A space. A possibility. Not a command. I sat there until the platform emptied. Until a new train pulled in and new people poured out. Until I could breathe again. Then I stood and went home. I didn't tell my husband. There was nothing to tell. Not yet. Instead, I made lunch, cleaned the bathroom, folded towels. Routine. Ritual. The acts that fill time with the illusion of control. He came home at 3. Kissed my cheek. Asked about dinner. Said something about the garden needing attention. I nodded through all of it. By 4, I was dressed again. He didn't ask where I was going. I told him I was meeting a friend. He smiled and said to enjoy myself. Then he went back to his newspaper, and I walked out the door. The old house wasn't far. A few blocks, a short drive. It belonged to a family friend who traveled often. Sometimes I used it when I needed quiet. It had tall windows, wooden floors, creaky stairs. Empty walls. It was always too cold in the winter, too warm in the summer. But it had space. When I arrived, the front porch was empty. No car. No sound. I sat on the steps and waited. At 5:07, he arrived. He walked toward me slowly, no urgency, no apology. Just presence. He sat beside me, not too close. We didn't speak at first. The silence was fuller than most conversations. After a while, he said, I wasn't sure if you'd come. I wasn't either, I replied. He looked ahead, not at me. You don't owe me anything. I know. Another pause. I just wanted you to know, he said, that what happened, I've thought about it more than I should have. And not because of guilt. Just because it mattered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Inside the house, the light shifted. Dust floated in the window's glow, making everything softer, older. I stood and walked inside. He followed. We moved through the rooms without speaking. The air felt familiar. Neutral. In the living room, I sat on the couch. He sat across from me. I don't want to ruin your life, he said quietly. You didn't, I said. But I might. I looked at him then. Really looked. I ruined it long before you showed up, I said. Not in the way people think. Not with betrayal. But with forgetting who I was. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sun dipped lower. The room turned gold. A breeze moved the curtain just enough to lift it from the sill. And then we spent the night together. No words. No explanation. Only breath. Only warmth. Only silence that didn't ache. The morning came slowly. The light entered the room gently, filtering through the thin curtains in threads that looked almost golden against the wooden floors. I opened my eyes to stillness, to the soft creak of the house settling, and to the sound of his breathing just a few feet away. He was sitting by the window, not looking at me, sketchbook in hand. The pencil moved lightly, almost absent-mindedly, like he was drawing only to quiet his thoughts. I stayed where I was, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket, not from sleep, but from something else, the kind of warmth that doesn't quite reach the skin but lingers underneath. There was no guilt in me. Not that morning. Not yet. There was only quiet, and the slow, full realization that I had crossed into a space I couldn't return from. and that I didn't want to. He looked over at me eventually, and we didn't say anything. Words would have broken the fragile line we were walking. There was nothing new to say, nothing that hadn't already been spoken in silence, in glances, in stillness. I sat up and pulled on the sweater I had left on the back of the chair the night before. My body moved like it remembered who I was before routine had pressed itself into every corner of me. I folded the blanket, not because it was expected, but because I needed the action, something small and neat, a task to complete in a morning that felt too open. He closed the sketchbook and set it down beside him. I didn't ask to see it. I didn't need to. The room smelled like old wood and morning air. I stood at the doorway for a moment, unsure of whether I should speak or just leave, but he broke the moment first. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. I shook my head. "I should go." He nodded. "Yeah. I figured." We walked out together, side by side but not touching. Outside, the sun was higher now, brushing the tops of the trees and warming the sidewalk. The world looked almost unchanged. Birds flew overhead, cars passed at normal speeds, and the breeze played with my hair the way it always did. But I was different. I knew that. He stopped a few feet from his car, and I turned toward him. Not to say goodbye. That word felt too final. Too clean. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too," he replied. I turned and walked down the street. I didn't look back. Back home, everything was as I had left it. My husband was working in the garden, wearing the gloves I had bought him last spring. He waved when he saw me, then went back to trimming the hedge. I stood at the front door for a second, watching him, and felt an ache I couldn't name. Not pain, exactly. More like distance. A soft, long stretch of space between us that had existed for years, disguised as familiarity. Inside, the house was filled with early afternoon light. I took off my shoes, washed my hands, made myself tea. Every movement felt rehearsed, like I was back on a stage I had stepped off briefly but had now returned to without fanfare. I sat in the kitchen and opened my phone. No new messages. I stared at the screen for a while, then put it face down and took a deep breath. The quiet pressed around me again, but it wasn't suffocating this time. It was reflective. Thoughtful. Heavy, but manageable. Later that evening, as I was folding laundry in our bedroom, my husband walked in with a mug of tea and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat on the edge of the bed, watching me. "You've seemed lighter lately," he said. "Lighter?" I asked. He nodded. "I don't know. Just clearer." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." We talked a little about the trip we were planning. He suggested a few places by the coast. I agreed to look at options. He kissed my forehead, told me he'd start dinner, and left the room. When he was gone, I sat down on the floor, leaned back against the bed frame, and closed my eyes. I didn't regret what had happened. I didn't replay the night like a movie. I didn't long for it. I didn't vilify it either. It just was. A moment that cracked something open. A moment that reminded me what it felt like to be seen not as an extension of someone else, not as a function, but as a whole person with edges and depth and contradiction. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up and walked downstairs, into the living room, where the silence felt thick. I pulled out my old sketchbook, the one buried beneath papers and receipts, and opened it. The pages were mostly empty, some yellowed with age. I picked up a pencil. I didn't try to draw a face. Or a memory. Or a feeling. I just drew. Lines. Curves. The shape of stillness. The echo of movement. Nothing specific. But it was mine. and I kept going until the sky outside turned blue again. The days after were filled with a strange tension. Not the kind that makes you anxious or restless, but the kind that settles in the background and colors everything without you realizing it. I went through my days mechanically, completing tasks with a sense of purpose, but the edge that had once been sharp in me was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost peaceful numbness. I did what I had always done. I watered the plants, folded the laundry, prepared dinner. My husband still noticed little changes, but they were subtle. He didn't ask, and I didn't volunteer any answers. He kept saying I seemed more present, more focused. I smiled and nodded in agreement. It was easier that way, to pretend everything was fine, even though I knew it wasn't. Even though I knew something had shifted beyond repair. My nights were the hardest. The quiet felt different then, more oppressive somehow. I lay in bed beside him, but there was a distance between us that I couldn't close. He would fall asleep quickly, but I'd stay awake, tracing patterns on the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering how we got here. The space between us was large now, like an empty room I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, as I folded yet another load of laundry, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. The one whose name I had seen in my phone days ago, the one whose words still lingered in the back of my mind like a whispered secret. I was thinking about you, the message read. I haven't forgotten. I stared at the words for a long time, trying to make sense of them. What did they mean? Did he want something from me? Or was it just a statement? A reminder of something neither of us had finished? I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't know how. But his message stayed with me. It pressed against the walls of my thoughts, kept me awake that night. It was like a crack in the surface, the first sign of something breaking through. The next day, I went to the park alone. I walked the familiar paths, past the tall trees and over the small bridge that crossed the stream. The weather had started to change, the air cooler, the leaves turning yellow and orange, swirling on the ground. I liked this time of year. It felt like a moment of pause before everything rushed toward the cold. It felt like the world was slowing down. I sat on a bench near the water, watching the leaves drift by, the sound of the stream gently bubbling beneath me. My thoughts were scattered. I tried not to think about the message, but it kept pulling me back. His words. His presence. The way it all felt too real. Too close. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to undo what had been done. I didn't know how to make it stop. The longer I stayed in the park, the clearer it became. I couldn't go back. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, unfeel what I had felt. I went home later, but something was different. It wasn't just the message. It wasn't just the time spent in the park. It was the realization that I had been lying to myself. I had been pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I had been going through the motions, trying to convince myself that I could erase the cracks with routine, with time. But time didn't heal this. Nothing would. That evening, my husband was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. I didn't speak to him at first. I just watched him, the way his eyes scanned the pages, the way his fingers turned each sheet. He seemed so unaware of the change, so unbothered by the invisible shift between us. Dinner's ready, I said quietly, setting the plates on the table. He looked up, smiled, and thanked me. We ate in silence. He asked me about my day, and I answered. It was the usual back and forth. His questions, my answers. The questions were empty, the answers were empty too. It was like we were actors in a play, reciting lines we had memorized. But the tension was still there, hanging in the air like smoke, not enough to suffocate, but enough to make it hard to breathe. After dinner, I went to the living room. I sat in the armchair, the one by the window, and stared out at the darkening sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was at a crossroads. I could keep pretending. I could keep living this half-life, this empty existence, and let time blur the edges of everything. Or I could face the truth. I wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. The phone buzzed again. Another message. "I'm still waiting," it said. The weight of it crashed down on me. I sat there, holding my phone, the world outside growing darker. The message wasn't just an invitation. It was a demand. It was a call to something I didn't know how to handle. And yet, I knew that I was already responding to it. I was already halfway there. I put the phone down and leaned back in the chair. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the house. The steady ticking of the clock. The soft shuffle of my husband in the other room, going about his own routine. Everything was as it should be. Everything was normal. And yet, everything was shattered. I didn't know what to do next. But I knew one thing: this wasn't going to end easily. The choices were laid out before me, but they were heavy, each one leading to something I couldn't quite see. But the message was still there, in my mind, in my heart. It wasn't going away. It was only the beginning. And I was already deep inside it. The days passed in a haze of muted emotions. I went through the motions, as I had before, but everything felt out of sync. The house, which once felt like my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every room was a reminder of something I couldn't escape. I'd find myself standing in the hallway, frozen, wondering what had happened to the woman I used to be. The woman who had everything in its place. The woman who had a life, a purpose, a routine. Now, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. My husband noticed the change, of course. He noticed that I had grown quieter, more distant. He mentioned it over dinner one night, his voice laced with concern. "You seem different lately," he said, pushing his food around on his plate. "Is everything okay?" I smiled weakly, avoiding his gaze. "I'm just tired," I said. "A lot on my mind." He didn't press. He never did. But the silence between us grew, and it wasn't the kind of silence that was comforting. It was the kind of silence that filled the spaces with unspoken words, with the weight of things left unsaid. I didn't tell him about the message. I didn't tell him about the note I had left behind. I didn't tell him about the way I felt when I stood in the living room, staring at the sketch, the lines of my own face drawn by someone else's hand. I didn't tell him that I had been waiting for something, for someone, for a feeling that never came. I spent the next few days in a haze, caught between the world I had built with him and the world that seemed to be pulling me somewhere else. I went for walks in the park, sat by the water, and stared at the trees as if they had answers. But there was nothing to be found. Only the quiet. The waiting. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, the doorbell rang. I had been in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, when I heard it. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew who it was, even before I opened the door. There he was, standing on the other side, looking just as he had the last time I saw him. The same calm expression, the same quiet confidence. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Something heavier. Something I couldn't name. "I didn't want to do this over text," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "But I had to see you." I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. My hands shook slightly as I closed the door behind him, and for a moment, we stood there in silence. Neither of us knew what to say, or maybe neither of us wanted to say it. He looked around the room, taking in the familiar sights. The sofa, the bookshelf, the old painting on the wall. It all felt so normal, so ordinary. And yet, everything between us had changed. "I didn't know what to do after I saw your message," he continued. I thought I was being foolish, but then I couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to step away, to shut him out, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part of me, the part one didn't recognize anymore, wanted to hear him, to listen to what he had to say. It was like a magnet pulling me in, and I couldn't resist it. "What are you saying?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm saying that I can't pretend anymore. I can't walk away from this. From you." I felt my chest tighten. The words he spoke were too familiar, too real. And yet, I didn't know what they meant. What was this? What had we done? What had I done? "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I can handle it." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from mine, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I didn't move. And for a moment, the room felt smaller. The air, thicker. There was no going back now. "I know," he said softly. "I don't know either. But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out." The silence that followed was suffocating, but I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something I couldn't name, but I felt it all the same. Finally, I broke the silence. "You should go," I said, my voice hoarse. "I can't. I can't do this right now." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he looked back at me, his eyes soft but certain. "I'll wait for you," he said. "When you're ready." I didn't answer. I couldn't. And then, he was gone. The house was silent again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just quiet. It was empty. Hollow. I sank into the couch, my hands resting on my lap, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. But even as I sat there, I knew one thing: this wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was no going back from where we were now. There was no unseeing the things we had seen, no unfeeling the things we had felt. And the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, heavy and undeniable.
Bye.